Due to its strategic importance, Norway was seen as an essential territory for the rapidly expanding Nazi Empire. Despite being at war with Britain and France, the Germans were able to conquer the country in just 2 months, cementing its grip on all of Scandinavia. Gaining control of Norway was vital for the Germans for 2 things. Firstly, as a base for naval units, including U-boats, to weaken Allied shipping in the North Atlantic, and secondly, to secure shipments of iron ore from Sweden, who maintained neutrality during the war, through the port of Narvik. Outmanned and outgunned, things were looking hopeless for Norway, and it seemed that nothing could stop the German war machine. That's not how everyone saw it, however, with many believing, despite the odds stacked against them, the fight for Norway had only just begun. Though elements of the Norwegian armed forces were taking the fight to Germany overseas, the fight for Norway itself would take a different form. Instead of taking place in the fields or on the seas, this underground war would take place in dank basements, on street corners, in seedy bars and shady alleyways. The use of conventional weapons was limited, so other tools were required, such as propaganda, disruption, and even assassination and sabotage. And it is here where Max Manus enters the story. Born on December 9th, 1914, in Bergen, Max Manus spent much of his early years travelling around the world with his family. This exotic lifestyle would all change, however, when in 1939 Manus joined the Norwegian army to fight alongside the Finns against the encroaching Soviet forces. Known as the Winter War, this conflict saw a much smaller Finno-Norwegian coalition force inflict considerable losses on the Soviet army, halting their advance and damaging their international reputation in the process. The Winter War ended with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, and though the fight against the Soviets was over for Manus, his fight against the Nazis was just beginning. Upon hearing of the German invasion of Norway, Manus returned to his homeland to join the resistance. Known simply as the Norwegian Campaign, the Allied attempt to defend Norway from the Nazis would end in defeat, with the surprising speed and scope of the German forces proving too much for the Allies. Defeated and ashamed of how quickly the Germans were able to conquer Norway, Manus made his way to Oslo, the country's capital, to join the underground resistance movement against their occupiers. Manus was now part of an underground resistance group known as the Oslo Gang, whose notable figures included Gregers Gram, Edvard Tolleksen, Kolbein Laring, Gunnar Sundsteby, amongst others. Though an experienced war veteran, Manus would have to abandon many of his military principles as he was now part of a largely different style of warfare. No longer were his enemies in trenches across a field. They were now hiding in plain sight. It could be his neighbour, the old lady across the street, the local shopkeeper, or people he deemed friends. Such was the terror that the German Gestapo instilled in the citizens of Norway. Through tactics of bullying, intimidation, and under the threat of punishment, many were forced to cooperate with the German secret police, though some, admittedly, would do so by choice. This wasn't a game for Manus and the rest of the Oslo Gang. They knew very well the danger they were putting themselves in by forming a resistance to the Nazi occupation of Norway. But to them, liberating their homeland was worth that risk. Manus would help produce illegal propaganda, something Gregers Gram placed particular importance on, to let the people of Norway know the fight was not over. And owing to his combat experience, he manufactured weapons for members of the movement. His combat experience in Finland and strong personality made him a leader figure in the Oslo Gang, with many gravitating around him. The group would continue their work, but began getting reckless. They made failed assassination attempts on Himmler and Goebbels when they visited Oslo, which with everything else made Manus a wanted man by the Gestapo. He would eventually be captured by the German secret police, but incredibly, to avoid arrest, Manus jumped out of a second-floor window, ending up in hospital instead of prison. Under constant guard, Manus was being treated in Oslo Hospital, though miraculously, with all things considered, he only had bruising and a minor concussion, meaning his recovery period would be short. However, the Norwegian doctor lied to the Gestapo, stating that Manus's injuries were much worse than they looked. This deceit allowed for Manus, with the help of the doctor and a nurse, to concoct a plan of escape. After 27 days, Manus made a dramatic escape out of a window, this time with a rope, and headed straight for the Swedish border, out of the Gestapo's zone of control. Despite this near miss, undeterred, Manus would return to the fold, forced to travel through the Soviet Union, Asia, Africa, North America and Ireland to avoid German surveillance. The Norwegian would make his way to Scotland to learn the art of sabotage with the British Army. It was here he would reunite with his friend and comrade Gregers Grum, both of whom would join the Special Forces group Company Linge. Now trained parachutists, Manus, Grum and a team of saboteurs were dropped in the woods near Oslo on the 12th of March 1943 to take their fight against the Germans to a new level. Taking part in Operation Mardonius, a plan which Manus and Grum helped devise, the team of saboteurs, travelling on kayaks, attached small magnetic limpet mines with time delays onto docked German vessels in the Oslo harbour. Despite the harbour being heavily guarded, they were undetected, and the plan was a success. The next day, 2 German ships and an oil lighter exploded and sank, right on cue. Following from Operation Mardonius, Manus proved a constant thorn in the German side, helping destroy countless ships, planes and cargo. This would go on for the next year. It was now 1944. The Normandy invasion had pushed the Germans back considerably, and it seemed the war was turning in favour of the Allies. This was the feeling in Norway as well, and it appeared that Manus and his friends would make it through the war relatively unscathed. This wasn't to be, however. Despite Manus eluding the Gestapo, Gregers Grum and Edvard Tollefsen were captured in a Gestapo sting operation. During the fray, Grum was killed by soldiers and Edvard Tollefsen was arrested. Sadly for Tollefsen, it is here where his story ends too. Unable to bear any more torture and unwilling to betray his comrades, he committed suicide in his prison cell. Several other members of the Oslo gang were killed around this time by the Nazis, but the resistance did not falter. Manus's exploits during the Second World War would reach a climax when he, along with fellow saboteur Roy Nielsen, blew up the Nazi battleship the Donau on the 16th of January 1945. Using a defunct goods lift, the pair planted 10 limpet mines below the waterline of the ship's hull. The mines would detonate on the morning of the 17th of January, with thousands of German soldiers and cargo aboard the ship, beaching the vessel. Coming at a pivotal point during the Second World War, the Allies and the Germans were engaged in the Battle of the Bulge, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Western Front, and the Germans were planning to send the forces they had stationed in Norway to the Ardennes forest to turn the tide of the battle and potentially the war. In a coordinated effort, a large amount of the major rail network was also blown up, along with the huge warship, immobilizing the Nazi forces and keeping them contained in Norway. This is a vital element to understanding the success of the Norwegian resistance movement. Not only did it achieve its objectives of liberating Norway, it also kept a considerable chunk of the German forces stuck in the country, instead of focusing their efforts on the Allied invasion. When considering there are about 300,000 fresh German troops stationed in Norway, it cannot be overstated what an impact keeping them there had on the outcome of the war. The Allied victory at the Battle of the Bulge would prove to be a watershed moment in the whole war, and had the Germans been able to bring the reinforcements from Norway, who knows how differently things may have been. From this point on, the Germans began a terminal retreat. Just a few months later, on the 8th of May 1945, the Nazis surrendered, and along with the rest of the Allied nations, Norway celebrated their victory in Europe. Like in cities and towns across the world, Norway celebrated its freedom, with Manus serving as a personal guard for the King and Crown Prince of Norway during these celebrations. For his heroism and achievements, Manus was awarded medals from many Allied nations, and in doing so became one of Norway's most decorated citizens. After the war, he would write extensively about his time during the global conflict, and is seen as a national hero to this day. After a long, fulfilling life, Max Manus passed away in 1996 at the age of 81, with the whole nation mourning their loss. With the Norwegian state radio proclaiming, Manus did more damage to the German war machine than many major military actions. Though we have focused on Max Manus and other key figures in the Norwegian resistance, small unnoticed actions by everyday Norwegians throughout the war were their own form of resistance to the Nazi Empire. Whether it was providing provisions and sanctuary for resistance fighters, withholding information from the Gestapo, or simply never giving up hope, these acts, as well as the ones we have covered, are ultimately what kept the spirit of the nation alive. To state the obvious, the Second World War was a complex war, arguably the most complex in history, meaning it is hard, if not impossible, to pinpoint a single reason as to why the Nazi Empire ultimately fell. So it would be unfair to say it was all because of Norway, but that isn't to say that Norway did not play a significant, albeit overlooked, role in the outcome of the war, because, as we have shown, it quite clearly did. At the very least, Norway acts as an example and a symbol of a country fighting well above its station for what it believed in, and Max Manus embodies that, perhaps more than any other. His tale is one of courage and coolness under pressure, where against near impossible odds and in the face of constant danger and loss, he put what he loved above all: his friends, his family, his country. Thank you for joining us at Canned History. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more, then like, comment and subscribe.